Hi, this is Dr. Claire, and this is our lecture on the carbon cycle. So carbon dioxide is a compound in our atmosphere that is constantly being changed from one form to another by biological processes. So photosynthesis is basically the fixation of carbon gas into a carbon-based molecule that we can then use as living organisms for storing energy and also for the building blocks of our bodies. All of our body compounds, our proteins, our lipids, our carbohydrates are all have a carbon-based backbone, and those carbon molecules originally come from carbon dioxide in the air. So during photosynthesis, basically what's happening is that you have 6 carbon dioxide molecules that are combined with 6 water molecules to create a single sugar molecule and 6 oxygen. So when you're going through photosynthesis, you go from carbon dioxide and water to sugar and oxygen. And then if you want to break down those sugars and turn them back into energy that you can use for things, you take your sugar and your 6 oxygen molecules and you turn it back into carbon dioxide and water. So when us heterotrophs, animals, when we breathe, we need the oxygen from the air to break down those sugars and get that energy, and then we produce carbon dioxide. So that's why we're always wanting to inhale oxygen and exhale carbon dioxide. Plants, on the other hand, they're going through photosynthesis. They need that carbon dioxide to build in photosynthesis into those sugars, and so they generally excrete oxygen. However, plant cells also need to break down those sugars. So at nighttime, plant cells can be producing carbon dioxide as well. So that's the cycle that the carbon is going through. Now, when you look at this on an ecosystem basis, we've got that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's getting fixed through photosynthesis, both by plants on land and by photosynthetic organisms in the water, algae and plants and little microbes and things that are photosynthetic. And so the carbon dioxide is going to be coming out of the atmosphere there. Then plants will be going through some respiration, so they will be releasing some amount of carbon dioxide back, but they're also getting eaten by heterotrophs, so it gets stored in animals and other heterotrophs when we eat those other things. And then, of course, when we break those things down, we're releasing carbon dioxide back into the air. And so it goes through this cycle, right? Of getting fixed into living organisms and getting released back into the air. A fair amount of carbon dioxide is also stored, dissolved in bodies of water, because it does dissolve in water. So there's going to be some dissolved oxygen that's stored in water. And then when things die, the biological molecules that make them up, there's 2 things that can happen. They can either be broken down by bacteria and other decomposers like fungus. And if the fungus and bacteria are breaking it down, then they'll be going through respiration and releasing carbon dioxide. But sometimes dead material can get buried in the earth, and so those carbon molecules can stay and not get re-released to the atmosphere. So you can have carbon that gets buried in the Earth's crust or buried in sediment at the bottom of the ocean, and that will sequester that carbon in those sediments. Under certain conditions, some of those biological materials can become compacted and mineralized and turned into fossil fuels. That's why they're called fossil fuels. All right, but it's all former living creatures that have been mineralized in particular ways. Okay, so that's the carbon cycle. And that's normal, and that's happening all the time. Carbon dioxide is constantly being fixed and released and fixed and released. All right, but if you look at what's been happening in recent times, the carbon dioxide historically it fluctuates. The levels do fluctuate over time. We have historical data from air bubbles in glaciers in the Antarctic that we can go back in time a really long way and look at what the carbon dioxide levels were like historically. But what you see since the 1800s and since the onset of industrialization is a really rapid increase in carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. So on this graph here, these red dots are data from ice core measurements from the Antarctic. The blue dots are data from directly measuring it. So once we had the technology to actually measure carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, we started doing that. That was in the late 50s is when we started measuring carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. And you can see that the red dots and the blue dots do overlap there. In the last 100 or so years, we've had a really, really dramatic raising of the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. So zooming in a little bit on this increase, this is the just the carbon dioxide measurements from the atmosphere. You see this very steady increase over time, but there's a yearly fluctuation. So the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere tend to go up through the late winter months, peaking in the early spring, and then decrease throughout the summer, and getting to the lowest point in the early fall, and then increasing again. So you see that very regular annual cycle. So if you think about that, what could be causing that? Well, it's yearly, so there's a seasonal component there. What's happening in the summer in the northern hemisphere? Well, that's summer. That's when plants are growing. And actually most of the land mass, most of the land on the planet is actually found in the northern hemisphere. And during the summertime, there's a lot of plant growth and a lot of carbon is fixed. So what you tend to see is as you start to get into late spring when plants are really starting to go, and throughout the summer when it's warm and they're photosynthesizing, the atmospheric carbon dioxide levels come down. Then you get to fall, October, November, the leaves come off the trees, all of the annual plants die back, and the levels start to increase again. So you do see that yearly fluctuation that's caused by plant growth, but over time, the average CO2 levels are drastically increasing. Okay, so let's take a look at where all this carbon dioxide is coming from. It's coming from humans. So there's a number of different ways that humans can add to the carbon dioxide levels in the environment. The biggest is fossil fuels. So this carbon that has been sequestered in the Earth's crust from former living creatures that's been buried and trapped, we dig it up and we use it as fuel. So we burn it. When we burn it, that releases that carbon back into carbon dioxide and releases it to the atmosphere. We also influence carbon dioxide levels through deforestation. So when we cut down forests, that limits the number of plants that can be fixing the carbon dioxide, and that increases it as well. But most of the carbon that's in the atmosphere now is actually caused by burning of fossil fuels. So that includes natural gas, oil, so gasoline, and coal. So all of those things were formerly trapped carbon dioxide that we're releasing in a very short period of time. So that's what's causing that increase. All right, so where does that carbon dioxide go? Well, some of it can go into the ocean. Some of it can go into plants on land. And what we do see is with the increased levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, there is increased photosynthesis because there's more carbon dioxide for plants to fix. So, and also some of it's just going to dissolve into the water in the ocean and increase the carbon dioxide levels in the ocean. So there is some that's going into increased photosynthesis that's being dissolved in the ocean, but there's so much carbon dioxide that we're releasing that most of it doesn't have anywhere to go and it just stays in the atmosphere. So 50% of the carbon dioxide that we're releasing ends up staying in the atmosphere and it doesn't go anywhere else. All right, so what's the connection between carbon dioxide and the global climate? So this is data from historical data from the last 400,000 years from the Antarctic ice sheet, looking at trapped bubbles. And from those trapped bubbles, we can tell both the carbon dioxide levels at that time and also from the ice sheets, the global temperature at that time. And so what we see is that carbon dioxide levels and global temperature historically have been very tightly correlated. When carbon dioxide levels are high, we tend to see high global temperatures. When they are low, we tend to see low global temperatures. This is because carbon dioxide is what we call a greenhouse gas. It reflects heat from the sun. So when the sunlight comes in, bounces off the earth, goes back out to the atmosphere, that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is going to reflect that heat back in. So it's basically like it's trapping the heat that would be released into space within the atmosphere. Okay. Now this data here is not actually going quite up to the present. It's about going up to around 1950. And if you look at carbon dioxide levels from 1950 on, what you see is that we have gone above any previously determined carbon dioxide levels that have been found on the planet. We are way above anything that's ever been measured before. And so because of this really tight correlation between carbon dioxide and global temperatures, we expect that because carbon dioxide levels are very high, we're going to see more temperature rises. And that's exactly what we've been seeing. So this is current temperature data that's been measured throughout the globe over the last 130 30 years. And we are seeing a very large global temperature spike. If you were born after 1976, you have never experienced a below average temperature year globally. If you were born after 1984, you have never experienced a single month that had a below average global temperature. It is drastically increasing. The last 3 years have been the 3 hottest years on record, and we're on track for another record hot year this year. So the data is very strong that supports this link between carbon dioxide and increasing global temperatures. So why do we care about this? Well, you have your poster children for climate change. This is a polar bear. Polar bears are dependent on sea ice. And the sea ice is shrinking. There is less sea ice in the Arctic than there used to be. So this is 1979 and 2007. I don't even have the data from more recently, but it's continuing on the same trajectory where there's less and less of this ice. Normally, polar bears go out on the sea ice and they hunt for seals, and that's where they get most of their food. But without the sea ice, they can't effectively get seals, and so they have to get other food sources. They're relying more on garbage dumps, and that increases human-bear conflict. So bears are getting killed by people because they're going into places where they're in contact with people. I mean, a polar bear, yeah, it looks at a human and thinks, dinner. Like they're one of the few animals that actually has no qualms about eating humans. So they're a very dangerous animal to humans. But we have guns, so the polar bear usually loses. So that's one problem. But maybe you don't care about polar bears. There are other reasons to be concerned, other ecological reasons to be concerned. The carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, as I said, is also becoming dissolved in the water, and that's causing the ocean to become more acidic. And many oceanic animals like corals and clams and mussels build shells out of calcium carbonate. And that calcium carbonate is more soluble when the ocean is more acidic. And so the carbon dioxide dissolving in the ocean, the increase of the carbon dioxide dissolving in the ocean, makes it harder for these animals to build their shells. So the corals and mussels and clams and oysters and basically everything that's got a carbon-based backbone or carbon-based shell in the ocean are at risk of not being able to build their shells. In addition, if you like coral, as the ocean temperatures rise, it's very difficult for the coral to survive. It stresses them when it's too warm. They can't get enough oxygen because oxygen doesn't dissolve very well in water when the water is warm. And so when they're very stressed, they tend to eject their symbiotic. They've got symbiotic photosynthetic algae that live within their bodies, and that's what gives coral its bright colors. But it also gives coral some of its food because those symbiotic algae produce sugars that feed the coral. And so when the coral are under stress, they'll eject those algae, and that causes coral bleaching, which can lead to the death of the coral. So there are scientists who say that climate change has already proceeded so far that there's no way to save places like the Great Barrier Reef, and that these giant coral communities that are such important parts of the aquatic ecosystem are on their way out and they're going to die. So it's a really important issue if you care about biodiversity and conservation, and also if you care about humans as well, because the sea levels are rising, places are flooding that weren't flooding before, we have more wildfires, we have more droughts, more extreme weather, more hurricanes. All of these things are caused by the increase in global temperatures. So it's pretty important. Okay, thank you.